You're listening to Innovators, the podcast from Harris Search Associates, where we speak with global leaders in education, research, engineering, and the health sciences, and ask them to share lessons learned as they continue to advance the frontiers of innovation and discovery. Today's podcast will be led by Rick Skinner, Senior Consultant.
American higher education continues to be considered the gold standard in terms of research-intensive universities, among which the nation's land-grant institutions are very well represented. Penn State, University of Illinois, Michigan State, and Cornell are among the land-grant institutions that also produce scholarship and new knowledge, as well as prepare students and render service to their respective states and the nation as a whole. The creation and evolution of land-grant universities reflect very much American democracy and the special tenor of their times. Even though the federal government provided both the initial funding and later continuing financial support for the land-grant colleges, as they were known initially, the funding went to the states, since the federal government's role in education played and continues to play a relatively small role in education, which is primarily a state and local government responsibility. Second, the land grants reflect the very straightforward reality of the vast geographic scale of America and the federal government's ability to sell land it owned and use the proceeds to support the colleges. Third, passage of the original legislation, the Morrill Act of 1862, reflects the very special circumstances of the time. A civil war in which 13 states had seceded from the Union and therefore vacated their seats in Congress, and that made it possible for the act to gain a majority in both the House of Representatives and the Senate, something it had never been able to do before. And finally, land-grant universities reflected advances in the 19th century in both scientific knowledge and its practical application in agriculture and the mechanical arts. The point here is that land-grant institutions were very much reflections of the times and a federal system of governance. There are any number of other federal laws that have affected higher education. Most of those, the GI Bill, the National Defense Education Act, Assistance Act, and the Higher Education Act of 1965, to mention just three, also reflected the distinctive set of circumstances during which they were enacted. It is precisely because we find ourselves in still another historical moment of change that we wanted to talk with someone well-versed in land-grant institutions, land-grant universities, who has to deal with the here and now, but also the new and changing realities of the times. Dr. Susan Fritz has spent all of her adult life at the University of Nebraska. A native of the state, she earned her undergraduate, master's, and doctoral degrees from the University of Lincoln, where she was a faculty member, department head, associate dean, associate vice chancellor, and interim dean. She joined the system office as an associate vice president, provost, and executive vice president, and as of August 15, 2019, interim president of the University of Nebraska, the first woman to be appointed president. Welcome to Innovators, Dr. Fritz.
Thank you, Rick. Good to be here.
I believe this is University of Nebraska is in its 150th year. And I think that means the world of sod huts out on the prairie is probably long gone, except as a historical site to visit. But does the mission as a land-grant university persist today? And how is that different from the mission of the 300 or so large, complex, mostly public, research-intensive universities in the United States? What goes on at the Lincoln campus that is all that different from what transpires at the Omaha campus or at the University of Iowa?
Well, let me break your questions down, Rick, because any one of them is kind of a dissertation. Does the mission as a land-grant university still persist today? Absolutely, no question about it. In Nebraska, the UNL campus is the only campus that we consider to be the land-grant university. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. However, if we go back 150 years ago, we would say that it was the land grant then as well, but we've added other campuses to our system. And so how do we differ at UNL from the mission of the complex research intensive universities? For one thing, there is an emphasis in agriculture and natural resources.
Mm-hmm.
There is an Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources, which is on the East Campus of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where there is a presence of cooperative extension,
Mm-hmm.
the Agricultural Research Division, or Experiment Station, as some institutions refer to it. And then, of course, the College of Agricultural Sciences and Natural Resources, and then a piece of the former College of Home Economics. And so those are all integrated together under the umbrella we call the Institute. That makes great sense because many faculty have appointments that are apportioned across primarily two of those areas. So, teaching and research, or teaching and extension, research and extension, and, some other permutations.
One thing of particular interest here is this. It sounds as though that particular part of the university is, by its very nature, at least transdisciplinary, if not interdisciplinary. Am I right?
Oh, absolutely.
Oh,
absolutely. In fact, I think that's one of the strengths, one of the many strengths. And so when you ask about what goes on the Lincoln campus that's different than the Omaha campus, I would say that certainly we see more multidisciplinary work at UNL than we do at UNO, for example. But again, remembering that UNO is primarily a teaching institution,
right.
a much smaller research portfolio, more focused portfolio. And then you ask the question about the University of Iowa. There's, I will say the cooperative extension piece of this is extremely important. So then when we think about the interplay between research and the practical problems of Nebraskans, the opportunity for us to take research from the lab or from the field to the producer or the citizen of the state and help them solve real world problems is very powerful. If we think in terms of textbooks, we hear, it used to be 5 to 6 years before discoveries would make it into textbooks and then in the classroom. When we have the opportunities of interplay between research, teaching, and extension, we can get those discoveries into the classrooms. We can also get them into the hands of producers.
It is fascinating to think that that land grant mission in and of itself was a stimulus to bring faculty who might otherwise cleave to, I'll be pejorative, somewhat narrow disciplines, to nevertheless branch out. And I'd never quite thought of the land grant university having that implication, but it's a crucial point in many ways.
It's fascinating to me, Rick, that oftentimes when we talk about problems, we can kind of put them on a spectrum, and we can look at the very slow and large, so think system, and then we can think of the very small, right to the molecular and kind of fast. We have real world problems that span the whole spectrum from system to molecular. And those problems need solutions by researchers who are working across those continuums.
I think that's something that we're going to need to file away, because that's an important point I'm not sure that we've given enough thought to. Let me go to a second question, because when I talked to people some 5 or 6 years back, there were large numbers of very loud complaints in some cases about land grant status. And it had to do with the fact that when the Second Morrill Act, the one that passed in 1890, I believe, it committed the federal government to providing continuing financial support for land grant colleges. Has that funding continued, and has its support for agriculture and engineering remained the primary foci?
Rick, that's a really good question. And one of the things that I would like to point out before I get to the meat of the answer here is thinking about where the educated populace was in 1890 and what the problems they were dealing with, what complexity they had as compared to today. We have a much more educated citizenry. We have much more sophisticated problems. The work that is going on now is of such technical quality and such a necessity if we're going to leapfrog forward in production agriculture, for example. So you can see that the funding and the focus of the funding has had to change with those changes of the citizenry needs and the sophistication at which they're operating at.
Good point.
So there has been morphing, and I would also say that the breadth of that funding is far different than it was in 1890. And again, that's because there have been disciplines that have emerged under this umbrella called agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
There's been diversification in engineering.
Oh.
And, we used to think of engineering related to agriculture as simply ag engineering, but
Exactly.
it's much more than that. And so the funding has been divided up to accommodate that. And then also there was the added focus of nutrition and community vitality. Again, if I go back to those earlier comments about systems, community vitality in a depopulating plains is a very important topic for us to have people who will live in the plains. We need to understand how to have thriving communities that will retain them.
I can tell you that some few years back, my wife and I took a journey across the plains. And one of the places we went to was Nebraska, and I remember going through Ogallala and several places. And to see the end of the small town and so forth, and the absence in some cases of healthcare, it was clearly we were going through something very major. And I imagine for the land grant is for universities, they've had not only to contend with that, but they've got to stay ahead of it so you can find ways that you can provide the kinds of services that people need.
Absolutely. And, for example, in our state, one of those challenges is access to broadband.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And if we're going to talk about community vitality and being able to be a learner in place or to establish a presence on the internet, you need to have access to good broadband.
And you have a slight advantage on that, in that Omaha is one of those central nodes back from the old days where there are a lot of big pipes running in, if I remember correctly.
That's true. But I think it's also important to point out that there were some parts of our state I would say were somewhat left behind because that last mile was not
exactly
a good business decision. And so it's trying to figure out how we can close those gaps. So by the very fact that you live in one of those areas, that you are not disadvantaged.
It's interesting you should say that. I spent 4 years in Canada, and there's this massive landmass with very small numbers of people. And this has been a struggle for them to find a way to deal with broadband. Because as you say, it effectively precludes you from being, in some ways, an active participant in almost everything that goes on. Let me turn to another kind of question that takes us out of the here and now in some respects. A land-grant university president, about a decade ago, posed some what I found to be very interesting questions. And this is a quote now. How should a major public university in the United States align its distinctive strengths to meet the needs and demands of a global society? How can such a university maintain and strengthen its commitment to the public good in the context of changing global dynamics? These questions have gained increased urgency in the 21st century for all universities, but in particular for the nation's land-grant universities founded under provisions of the Morrill Act of 1862. The urgent need for new ways to think about a higher education as an enterprise has provoked these questions, since our nation's best universities are the foundation for building sustainable global prosperity. 10 years later, Dr. Fritz, are those questions still relevant, especially to a land-grant university such as yours? And if so, how has the University of Nebraska chosen to attempt to answer them?
Well, those are excellent questions, and I would say that they are still some of the questions that our university and universities like us are dealing with today. The first part of that question is, how does a major university align its distinctive strengths to meet the needs of a global society? And I think by first and foremost understanding what the strengths of the university are. Understanding where those peaks of excellence are, and maybe where the foothills are, where investments never will quite get them to peaks. and then trying to leverage those strengths to be as helpful as possible in solving some of the more vexing global problems. I also think that it is incredibly important that universities continue to invest in professional development funds for faculty and staff. We know that our friends in business and industry do this with some regularity, and we can't assume that everyone is going to be the captain of their own learning ship. I think that we need to be very clear on where the university is moving toward, or where the departments are moving toward. And then for people who do need the opportunity to sharpen skills or develop a new focus, that we use professional development leaves and professional development dollars, help people continue to develop and move parallel with the university.
I have to comment on one just quick comment. The last time I was on the Lincoln campus, I walked across it, and one of the things that struck me was a sense of the United Nations.
Yeah.
Extraordinary diversity of faculty, students, and staff. Is that continuing?
Yes, it is. Absolutely is. And I will say that, one of the reasons why we have such a robust international student enrollment, some of it has to do with the safeness of the Midwest. I also think a longstanding reputation in many countries with students and their parents and their grandparents who have been educated at the University of Nebraska. So we see that in the generational recruitment opportunity there. And so we see many students continuing on in their grandparents and parents' footsteps.
I interrupted you a moment ago, and I think you were going to address the question of, in addition to professional development, are there other things the University of Nebraska is undertaking to gain that alignment the president alluded to earlier? Are there other things that have made it possible for the University of Nebraska to align with what is right now a very uncertain global environment?
Well, I will tell you that, we have narrowed our focus and tried to help encourage relationship building in particular countries around the world. Now, that's not exclusionary, but one of the things that has been abundantly clear for me for years is that when we have faculty that what I'll call have one-off relationships with faculty in another country, if we don't build continuity into the relationship, it is such a waste of resources, waste of an opportunity. Because to my way of thinking, the most help we can give is when we have a relationship that is more than one mission deep. So if our relationship is just based on research, if we can also build in teaching, or if we can build in outreach into that, then I think we have a greater chance of having a transformational relationship that will go beyond the current faculty from either side of that relationship being together. And I think that's when we start to see differences. That's how the University of Nebraska was instrumental in building Ataturk University in Turkey. Was a game changer for that country. And also did something quite similar, I believe it was in Colombia. And as a result of that, for many, many years, we had streams of students. We currently are doing something like that at UNL with students from Rwanda and helping the university there as well. So
fascinating.
Very exciting.
It is. And I'm trying to imagine, having been to Rwanda, what someone from Rwanda thought when they looked out on the Nebraska plains. Must have been a really great experience. I want to talk about research and its place in the mission and priorities of a land-grant university. I don't know many people who say, no, universities shouldn't be involved in scholarship and research. But states, more often than not, don't put much in the way of financial support for higher education. And in the last 10 years, in real dollars, it's declined by about $9 billion. So as a result, critics have argued that research ought to be funded by the federal government and by private foundations, not state funds or student tuition. Now, universities are, not surprisingly, counter that research is essential, especially if you're a land-grant university, in order to ensure, if only to ensure, that what students learn is based on current knowledge. How much of a priority is research for your land-grant university? And if it's critical, what should be the source of the funds to pay for research? Should federal grants, foundation philanthropy, business investments, should they supplant state support of research?
Well, Rick, I will tell you at the University of Nebraska system, the Board of Regents are on record as saying our number one mission is teaching, our second mission is research, and our third mission is service.
There you go.
And so when you ask, is it a priority at the University of Nebraska? Yes, research is. It's second to teaching. And I will tell you, from me, I think that these three are inextricably linked when we talk about the land-grant university. And so, you know, I appreciate the regents helping us with that ordering, because in times of budget crunches, it doesn't matter when we're making cuts. I think that research at the university will always be important because our public needs a source of unbiased information that's rooted in rigorous research, that adheres to scientific methods and has passed the scrutiny of peers. I also believe that it is important for us to have a variety of sources for funding. I'm not a purist in this regard. Not solely federal, not solely state. And I say that because there are some problems that are specific to states. There are some problems that are specific to regions. So opportunities for multi-state research is incredibly important. And those are generally projects that address big problems. And we need to be able to scale, to build large multidisciplinary teams, to bring the best talent to bear on those problems so that they can be addressed in an efficient and effective manner, and that those solutions then can be shared with the citizens who are addressing those problems every day in their lives.
One more question, and it's one that I've been very eager to pose to you. And I know it sometimes seems that the last thing we need is for the federal government to suggest doing things differently. But just for the moment, entertain this. If the federal government proposed rethinking and revising the Morrill Act and all of the changes to it over the past century and a half, what would you propose be changed? Access of students, service to communities, the focus on practical knowledge? And let me be more specific in this case. What if the federal government said, we're going to end these annual grants, but in return, we're going to give you a one-time grant of, I'll pick a number, $1 billion that could either be an endowment, the proceeds of which could be used by the institutions, albeit with the approval of the governor or the state, or spent as the university saw fit until exhausted, again, with the approval of state government. If a new bargain could be struck, what would be some of its key elements for the University of Nebraska?
Well, again, this is, Susan talking. So I would say that those key elements would need to be things like an emphasis on collaboration, an emphasis on multidisciplinary where appropriate, that we should look to partner for building teams with regional expertise. We should look to increase the use of technology, consistently doing that, and that the research process should be fast-paced, and that we should have a responsive system so that our citizens are getting answers so they can address those real-world problems. Because I think sometimes people are critical of the speed at which we respond as universities. But I will quickly say that in order to follow rigorous research with scientific methods that it passes the scrutiny of peers, there's only so fast you can move with that, with or without technology. Those would be some of the things, Rick, that I would say would be very important. I would also, when I say multidisciplinary, I not only mean across the sciences, I would include social science in that. I think that we have increasingly through the years come to realize that if we're going to change people's behaviors, that we need to understand where they're at, what would motivate them to change. And I think that is an important addition to many research teams that are seeking behavioral change.
You have a sense of the fact that not only is the land grant mission still resonating, not just within institutions, but within a broader community of stakeholders. Number two, the fact that it is in many ways based in and rooted in a state provides it the opportunity to distinguish itself largely due to the distinctive characteristics of a state. Third, you've made perhaps one of the most powerful cases for why research needs to be done at a land grant university. So we like to leave our listeners with a couple of walkaways so that when they forget that I really do look like Brad Pitt and so forth, they say, well, but I know that Dr. Fritz at University of Nebraska has told me I should be thinking about, what would this be?
Well, I can tell you don't look like Brad Pitt, but that's okay.
No. Oh, no.
So I think that to remind ourselves that even though we often talk about three distinct missions, that they are inextricably related to one another. Mm-hmm. And when those three missions are inextricably linked, that is the most powerful opportunity for the students and the citizens to benefit from that. And that's really the essence of the land grant. And I think that it is a tribute to the 157-year-old legislation that we still have the land grant today, and that it has been allowed to morph and change and continue to be responsive in ways that were probably almost impossible to imagine in 1862 and 1890 and 1914.
Susan, thank you very much for all that you're doing, for all that you will do, but especially for giving time to us today to explore really with someone who's very, very much not only committed to, but understands what the power of a land grant university is. Thank you very much for being part of Innovators, and we hope to have you back again sometime soon.
It's always a pleasure, Rick. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Innovators, a production of Harris Search Associates. We'll have more insightful conversations with global thought leaders to follow.